Welcome to the Commonwealth Matters. This is Richard Nelson, Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center. Christian nationalism. Should followers of Jesus work to build a Christian nation? Or is there some kind of danger, perhaps the compromise of a Christian witness? Joining us for today's program is Dr. John Wilsey. He is a professor of American history at Southern Seminary. Dr. Wilsey is an author, most notably of One Nation Under God, and Evangelical Critique of Christian America, and American Exceptionalism and Civil Religion, Reassessing the History of an Idea. Dr. Wilsey is an affiliate scholar with the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, and a senior fellow with the Center for Religion, Democracy, and Culture. Dr. Wilsey, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, Dr. Wilsey, this is a timely topic. There's a lot of talk about Christian nationalism today. This term means different things to different people. So I think it'd be helpful to start out with the definition of how you define Christian nationalism.
Well, thanks for that. Yes, I agree. It is a fraught term, and it is a loaded term. Mm-hmm. And as a fraught term and as a loaded term, by definition, it's hard to nail down a precise and agreed upon understanding of what this is. And I just would say that I would affirm that Christian nationalism is very difficult to define. Mm-hmm. It whenever you're having a conversation about it, you do have to agree to some ground rules about what you're talking about and how you're going to understand the term. Yeah. So I appreciate you, starting the conversation off with that. There is no one definition of Christian nationalism. You have a range, of definitions, and I think if you ask me, which I guess you are, you have to define Christian nationalism through a historical lens, because Christian nationalism is not something that is new. Christian nationalism has always been a part of us in America, and not just in the United States, but going all the way back to the colonial founding. Mm-hmm. Christian nationalism in some shape, in some form, in some articulation has always existed for Americans, and not just for Americans, mm-hmm. but for every Western state entity or kingdom, going all the way back to pre-Constantinian days. Mm-hmm. The idea of a Christian nation or Christian nationalism has its roots in the Old Testament. All the way back to the establishment of the covenant in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, particularly Deuteronomy. Yeah. That's been the inspiration for any kind of form of Christian nationalism that we see in American history, for sure. Yeah. And certainly that's true also for other forms of Christian nationalism in England, mm-hmm. And Scotland in particular, in the English-speaking world. Mm-hmm. So in America, I have argued that there have been at least 7 different articulations of Christian nationalism in American history, going back to the 1600s. Okay. And what's interesting about those, Richard, is that most of the time, those who have wanted to embrace a vision of a Christian nation have embraced a progressive view of history, an idea that the future is better than the past, and that hope is in the future and not in the past, and that we are advancing as a nation. We're advancing morally and technologically and politically and so forth. We're getting better. And on those who have embraced a progressive view of history have also been progressives. Interestingly enough, have been on the left, especially in the 20th century. For most of the 20th century, and going back to the 19th century, those who embraced a idea of a Christian nation were on the left, which I think is
fascinating,
amazing, fascinating thing. It's only been in the last 50 years or so that Christian nationalism has become a conservative idea, and it is a conservative idea now because it orients the nation into the past, whereas those earlier people in the 20th century oriented the nation to the future. So we've oriented the nation to the past, and that we look back to the founding, we look back to the founding fathers, to the faith of the founding fathers, we look back to the ideas of biblical ideas, Christian ideas that are found in the founding documents and so forth. So that's looking back and saying, let's try to recover and restore something that's been lost.
So if I could interject, let's look at our nation's founding. We do know that many of the founding fathers had a biblical worldview. They understood the inherent sinfulness of man. They did not trust centralized authority, so they created this idea of a government, 3 branches of government with checks and balances. They believe that our rights come from God, not from government. Some of these founders brought that, many of them did, I would say, brought that biblical worldview into the creation of the Constitution. We see references to God in the Declaration of Independence, our founding political document,
Sure.
where God is the author of our rights and our liberties. The purpose of government, if you read further, is to secure our inalienable rights. That's a radically new idea in the history of governments in the world.
Absolutely.
So we see these, not all the founders were Christians, some were deists, but many of them were deeply religious, deeply committed to their faith, and they came together from their colonial experience. By the way, the colonies were distinctly Christian colonies. Every one of them, they had Christianity written into their constitutions. You could not hold office unless you were a Christian in good standing. You had to, if you were to hold office, you had to acknowledge the Old and New Testaments in some of the colonies. So we saw they came from the background of coming from very clearly Christian context as far as Christianity's relationship to government, but they also saw the pitfalls of an established Christian religion. I don't know if we see that today, when I think most Christians and many of our listeners would be saying today, look, our country has lost its moral compass. We don't know what's right from wrong. We're seeing immorality that none of us have seen in our lifetimes, and they're shaking their head. And I think the reflex, Dr. Wilsey, is to say we need to embrace Christian values, and maybe we need to recapture what they think is a Christian nation. And full disclosure, I've dedicated my entire life to working for biblical values in our culture, to encouraging Christians to engage culture from a biblical worldview, and to bring a Christian influence into that realm. So I've seen a lot in the 25 years that we have engaged here, and yet at the same time, I see some of the dangers with an established religion in any nation. And this is where I want to go with this. I guess this is, do you think that Christians today that are concerned about the direction of the nation, like I am, concerned about immorality, concerned about what our kids are learning in schools, concerned about the fact that we don't have a shared moral compass anymore, do you think that Christians are wrongly saying, well, we need to establish a Christian nation, or we need to get prayer back into the schools, or whatever it might be? I know I just threw a lot at you right there.
Yeah. Well, you threw a lot at me, but it's really a pretty simple question. One thing that I've spent many years trying to make sense of with regard to this question is when the question of, was America founded as a Christian nation?
Yeah.
One thing that strikes me is that I'm convinced that America was not founded as a Christian nation. It was founded as a nation with religious freedom. Yeah. The founders were all in agreement. Now, when you talk about the founders, you have to remember there's 54 people at the Constitutional Convention, 54 individual people, and they disagreed with each other. So they're not a block, they're not a monolithic group. But having said that, they all agreed that religion, and they were thinking of Christianity because that was their frame of reference in the 18th century. Religion is good and necessary for the cohesion of society. But the best way for religion's influence and Christianity's influence to permeate the society, to secure order and social cohesion and a just and peaceful society at peace with itself, at peace with its neighbors, is through disestablishment and the free exercise of religion for families and free individuals and for communities. And what's interesting is that Alexis de Tocqueville, the most famous foreign visitor to America, who came here in 1831 and wrote Democracy in America in 1835 and 1840, two-volume work, a generation or two later, after the Constitutional Convention, he came to America. He traveled all over the United States at the time, and he affirmed what they theorized about. That he said, nowhere that I've traveled, he was a well-traveled person. He'd been to England. He later in his career went to Algeria. He said, nowhere in my travels have I seen a more religious people. He said that the culture was infused with Christianity, and that the secret to the success of religion in the society was the disestablishment, religious freedom. So I'm with you. I'm completely with you. I've at my entire adult life as well, I have worked for biblical values in the culture myself as well. And I'm very concerned about the way things are going, and your listeners are very concerned about the way things are going. And we're all one on that. We're on the same page on that concern. And I understand the concern, the desire to see, hey, let's get the government behind an established church or something like that. That's an idea whose time has come. Look, that idea was tried and experimented with for 1400 years universally in the Western world. Universally. The First Amendment to the Constitution is the first legal document since the Edict of Milan in 312 that has anything at all to do with religious freedom. Edict of Milan gave toleration to the Christians in the Roman Empire. The First Amendment secures religious freedom for American citizens. And the 14th Amendment extends that to individual citizens. That's where we've got to hold the line. We have got to insist upon religious freedom. Mark 12:17, Jesus said, "Render to God the things that are God's, and render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." Or I got it backwards. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Yeah. There are two jurisdictions. The state does not have jurisdiction over the conscience. It doesn't. Biblically, the state does not have jurisdiction. The idea that the state is some kind of an ethical entity is not a Christian idea. It is an idea from German philosophy of the 19th century, especially through G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel thought that the state was the ultimate ethical expression, And it's through this progressive movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century. They were deeply informed by Hegel. Theodore Roosevelt was somebody deeply, deeply informed by Hegel. Woodrow Wilson, deeply informed by Hegel. They saw the state as being an ethical entity, an ethical principle, and the ultimate expression of freedom. When I hear and read people who want to establish a Christian faith, or when you use the coercion of the state in order to enforce these things, that is not biblical. It is Hegelian. It is a purely modern and I would say not necessarily anti-biblical, but certainly extra-biblical idea that Christians need to back off from. Religious freedom is biblical. Romans 13, as I said, Mark 12, other passages delineate the differences between the jurisdictions. Each jurisdiction has, a particular purview, but the state does not have jurisdiction over the conscience. And that's always going to be the key and the secret to the success of, Christians who are out there doing what you're doing and out there trying to, witness to people and evangelize and see the culture converted through the lives and through the testimonies of individual people. That's what the church's job is. And we can't give up on that.
Very good. If you're just joining us, you're listening to The Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Dr. John Wilsey. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Dr. Wilsey, just before the break, you had mentioned the term disestablishment. And for the sake of the listeners, disestablishment is where the church and state are no longer functioning together in tandem. And that's what we saw in Europe and in the colonies, where it was law for people to be Christian. It was law for people to go to church. It was enforced by the law, by the state, for people to do certain things. And what the founding fathers did is they said, look, there is the realm of the church. There's a realm of the state. That is not the state's job to enforce Christian doctrine. It is not the state's job to make all people Christians or to follow whatever faith the government says that they should follow. And that's, I think, an important distinction to make here. The First Amendment is something that secures our religious freedom. It says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we have been blessed with religious freedom, as de Tocqueville noted when he wrote Democracy in America, and as you mentioned. But you had mentioned that the state should respect conscience. The state should not meddle with conscience. But here we are in 2023, where you have state laws and federal laws, arguably, that do violate conscience. I'm thinking of so-called statewide fairness ordinances that elevate homosexual identity, LGBT identity to protected status. Those laws have been used to go after Christian business owners, especially, to force them to put their deep religious convictions on the shelf. I think of the Respect for Marriage Act at the federal level. That's a clear conflict. There's a conflict on the horizon where Christians who want to operate in the marketplace are going to have to make decisions. So what do you say? I'll frame it this way. What is our Christian response to that, where the state has gotten involved? They've made a moral judgment, and that morality clearly flies in the face of Christian ethics, especially Christian sexual ethics. Where do we begin in the Christian community with that?
We start where we always start. We start with the Word of God. And the first thing we do is we heed Paul's admonition in Romans 2. Those who you say, do not steal, do you steal? Those who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? Those who say don't rob the temple, do you rob the temple? First of all, we have to let the scriptures be a mirror to ourselves as individuals, as churches, as families. We have to understand the Bible. We have to read the Bible. We have to eat the Bible. We have to let the Bible be absorbed into our beings. We have to be, conformed to the mind of Christ ourselves. That's where we start. And from there, when our government, which has been corrupted by a godless culture, and it's been a slow process. It's been a long process. It's been a slow process. It's been imperceptible to many of us. But nevertheless, here we are. When the government wants to force Christian people to go against their conscience, Christian people have to obey God rather than man. We have to preach. We have to advocate in the public square. I mean, when I think about Roe v. Wade, what individual Christians and what churches, small churches, small congregations, local communities have accomplished in the last 50 years. That shows us that this Christian engagement in the public square is not a futile exercise. Yeah. It's a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. The culture is wicked. It's corrupt, and it's not going to change these are things that we need to expect are going to get worse. But it's not a futile exercise for Christians to engage in the public square, because successes are there, they're possible, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade is evidence of that. It's easy to get discouraged by these things, but as conservative Christians, and I want to emphasize that word conservative for a minute. Conservatives recognize all the things that you pointed out, the founders pointed out earlier, that a realistic view of human nature is fallen. Government is a means for which sinful people can reach for power, which is a terrible thing. But conservatives also understand that these things take time. And conservatives have to be patient. We have to recognize that, in our lifetime, we may not see any victories. We may not see any successes. Our children may not either. But we have to keep on pressing. We have to keep on moving forward. I think about the, what Black people have undergone in this country, slavery through Jim Crow. They had a perspective on patience and slowness. They were willing to pay the price and to take it on the chin, and they didn't expect things to, necessarily come around their way. They were informed. The civil rights movement was informed by the church and by the Bible.
Yeah.
And they were patient, and they saw success. So, that's another example of, the overturning of segregation and unjust, treatment in the public square and the economic square and all the rest. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes determination. It takes a will.
Yeah.
It takes resources and sacrifice, and we can't expect these things to happen overnight. But I think when your question of where do we start, and I have to say the same thing. Am I being conformed to the image of Christ? And if that's not true, if we're not being conformed to the image of Christ first, then what are we even doing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I want to go back to the founding of this country. I know I'm taking a couple of steps back, but I'm trying to get clarity as to an appropriate Christian influence in politics and in government. And that's something, again, I've dedicated my life to working for biblical values in the culture. I believe God has called me to this. And I do believe that Christians have a place in government. We have a place when it comes to speaking God's truth into all areas of life, including government. And this doesn't make me triumphalist, by the way. I'm not saying we just need to get all the Christians into office and pass all Christian laws, and with the magic wand, everything's going to be better. I have no illusions to that at all.
Right.
But I want to go back to the founding of this country. Could the United States even have began as a country without Christian influence, significant Christian influence?
No,
okay.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so with that, and I agree with you.
Yeah,
so I want to go from there to appropriate Christian influence. We realize that we're not going to bring about perfection to the human race through government or through this liberal, this progressive mentality that is just we're going to perfect man, right? Through better policies, through science, through the arts, whatever it is. And yet there is the reality that as Christians, we want to engage life, including government, to the glory of God. We want to do science to the glory of God. We want to create masterpieces in art. We want to make music to the glory of God, but we realize that we're still fallen, and we're not going to create a heaven on earth. So where I'm going with this is, what is that balance? Is Christians who care about this country, as Christians who want to be politically engaged, I guess maybe I'm asking, how do we temper our expectations? I'm thinking out loud with you, brother. How do we appropriately engage without being utterly discouraged, which the many people that I cross paths with are utterly discouraged, or overly triumphalistic, where we just think we need to get a majority of Christians into office and we're going to fix everything? How do we walk that fine line? And I brought a couple of different thoughts in there to you, but
no, it's a great question. I think we can take our cues to start off with from the book of Jeremiah.
Okay.
If we look at Jeremiah, to say, broadly speaking, 28 through 33, where Jeremiah is laying out the basis for the new covenant. He's also talking about, the nation is going to be exiled. They're going to be carried off to Babylon, and for 70 years they're going to be in a foreign land.
Yeah.
And in that foreign land, what is their task? Their task is to pray for the city. Their task is to bear children, get married. Commit themselves to the flourishment of the land that they're going to go to.
Yeah.
Knowing that they're going to come home. I think if you read in Jeremiah 28, Jeremiah 29 especially, we have a serious, very good blueprint for how to strike that balance. We are not at home here. America is my country. I think America is the greatest country in the history of the world. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I don't understand people who want to leave the country and whatever. And a lot of times my first response is say, bye, This country is the greatest country. I come from a long military tradition. My ancestors fought for this country. This is the best country in the world, and we are blessed to live here. And America truly is, I would say, an exceptional nation. But this is not our home. Yeah. We will all die. The dead tell us, the dead remind us, that as you are now, I once was, and as I am, you one day will be. Yeah. Our home is in heaven. And what you talked about in your question, the lead up to your question, is very Augustinian. You basically were summarizing his thesis in City of God. And Augustine's vision for history, and Augustine's sort of way that he's going to tie that tension together between the temporal and the spiritual, it's going to be rooted in Jeremiah and the Bible, and informed by his current events. He saw the city of Rome destroyed in 410 by a barbarian king. Christians were wondering what's going on here. Is this crazy? Kind of like Christians are wondering today. And that was his thesis. That look, Rome's great, Rome's wonderful, Rome's our home, but Rome's not pure. Rome's got a lot of problems too, and one day Rome will fall. And if your hope is with the city of man, you will fall with it. Yeah. You have to embrace the city of God. Our citizenship is in heaven; it's not here. Yeah. Now, if we allow ourselves to be animated by that vision, it will sort of naturally redound to a responsible, engaged public engagement that is biblical. If that's our perspective, then it will have a consequence for the way that we act here, and the way that we seek to preserve, the United States of America, and all that's good about the United States, and all that's right about the United States, and all that's, it's founding ideals that are indeed consistent with biblical teaching. All those things we cherish, those things will be preserved if we live out, that sort of ordered love, where, love for country is absolutely a biblical virtue, because love is a theological virtue, but it has to be ordered correctly. It has to be ordered aright. Our love for the Lord and our loyalty to our heavenly home comes first. Comes before our love for our temporal home. But our temporal home and love for temporal home is certainly a biblical principle and a good thing, something we should work for. Yeah.
This is good, Dr. Wilsey. We are out of time, and it feels like I just scratched the surface of this conversation. I had many more questions here. Perhaps you can come back another time and we can talk further about this topic. So, hey, great having you on the program. God bless you, and you keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me.